Now we're going to make our flying geese, and this is called the no waste flying geese method. Because of the way we put our blocks together, we have very minimal waste when making it this way, as opposed to the way it was done years ago. There was a substantial amount of fabric that we would lose. So we're using our 4.5-inch square, and then we have two 2.5-inch squares. And the first thing we're going to do is sew diagonally from one side to the other. Now you can see that there's a line drawn from corner to corner, and that's the line that we're going to be cutting on. So I want to make sure I sew 1/4 inch to each side. And when I get close, I'm going to stop and put my second block in place and tuck it underneath and make sure that my lines are in alignment and continue on my seam to the other side. All right, then when we get here, we're going to turn around and come back the other direction. So I'm going to line this up again. I'm lining it against the cutting line because that's technically the edge of my fabric. But by doing it this way, we don't cut the corners, or excuse me, we don't cut the angles until we've done the sewing. The beauty of that is these bias seams are going to be held together really well in the fabric before it's cut. Sewing this after the fact, when you're sewing triangles to triangles, can be difficult because that fabric wants to stretch when you cut it on the bias or on the diagonal. So this works out really well. Now, you do want to watch this point right here. As you're sewing down this line, I don't want to use my finger and get too close to the needle. I'll use either my seam ripper or use a little stiletto, whatever you have handy, and just to hold it in place. And then once you're through, finish off. We're just going to cut our threads. Now, the next thing we're going to do is the second half. And first we want to press this. If you'll notice, do you see how this doesn't lay perfectly flat? When we first started, the square was nice and flat, but we're sewing on the diagonal, and that tends to kind of shift the fabric a little bit. So at this point, you want to press this from the back side, and you only want to press from side to side in each direction. Don't get caught in trying to press along the seam because that's your bias and it can stretch and that will distort your fabric. And ultimately, your block may not come out as square as you'd like. So press this well. And I have one here already that I've pressed. And the next step is to cut this in half. And we're going to cut this right along the line that we drew. And now what we're going to do is press these open this way. So we're going to open this up in this direction, here and here, and the same here. And again, we're going to press it. So we want that seam to come towards the small triangles. And I happen to have two right here that are nice and pressed. And what I'm going to do now is add the extra 2.5-inch square to each of these to make my flying geese. And I'm going to line the first corner right here with this outer edge and line these corners up and this in the middle. Now what I want you to notice is if you'll see that this little square from the smaller block that we're putting in fits right in the center here. Do you see that? And that little spot right here and right here is where your seam allowance is going to go. So it pretty well lays it out for you so you know just where to sew. You want to line yourself up and start your sewing right there in that corner and come all the way down to the edge. And when we reach the other side, we just spin around and come back up the other side. just like that. And once this, let's get those threads cut, is sewn on both sides, we're going to turn it over and press it on the back just like we did the other one. And so we'll have it nice and flat, and then we cut this along the line, just like that. And when we open this up, see how we get our nice flying geese. Now, the one thing you want to take a look at, and these are a couple points along the way that you can check. So when you first start sewing that extra block in, you watch that point up at the top, and that's your seam allowance. When you get to this point, you want to open this up and make sure that this is relatively straight. Now, sometimes these two pieces may not line up exactly aligned, and a little bit's okay, but you need to have a 1/4 inch from here to there. And what you can do is put your line of your ruler right on that point and make sure you, whoops, there we go, have that 1/4 inch seam right there. And that's going to be important for assembling your block. Now at this point we'd go through and we're going to press this, and we have our flying geese. And when I get the other pieces done, we're going to have a full set of 4 for each of these. So let me go ahead and get these pressed. I want to show you next how we're going to trim them, because these are a little bit oversized, which is wonderful because it gives you some flexibility and it allows you to trim off excess rather than coming up too short. Because if you make your block and it comes up small, it's not going to go together well. So this works out perfectly. All right, let me go ahead and get this ready, and I'll show you the next step. An important step to this quilt is trimming the flying geese. We need them to measure 2 inches by 3.5, but they measure probably closer to 2.5 by almost 4 inches, and that's because we use oversized blocks to make them. That's a good thing because that gives you enough allowance to trim this down so you get it just the right size. If it were made with smaller pieces of fabric, there was too much of a chance that this block could come up short and wouldn't fit. So I'd rather have it come out a little bigger and trim it. It's going to work better. Now, the other thing I want to show you is I'm going to use a square ruler. And the important thing that we're going to utilize here is this 45-degree angle. And it goes from corner to corner in both directions. And notice it says 45 right there. Now our block is going to finish at 3.5 by 2 inches. So it's going to be that size. And if we put one in here right now, we can see that it is at about 3 3/4 by about 2 1/8. So it's not that much bigger. But what we want to do is make sure when we are trimming that we follow the 45-degree line. That angle is important for our flying geese to be centered and to have it flying straight. We don't want geese going every which direction. And I'm just going to do this on top of paper because I think it's going to be easier. So what we're going to do is we want to find the center of 3.5, and it's going to be at 1 3/4. So this center point right here, 1 3/4, you see that line, that's going to be the middle that will fall right here on that point. So when we put our ruler on top of our flying geese block, we want to make sure that this 1 1/4 right here lines up there. So let me go ahead and put that in place. There we are. And while we're doing that, we also want to make sure that our 45-degree angle is falling right in line with the flying geese block. So we have our flying geese 45-degree angle, and we have our 1/4 inch seam allowance, and it's lined up in the middle, right down the center at 1 3/4. So you just want to make sure that you're covered in those spots. Now I'm going to take the paper away because what I want to show you is you also want to make sure you're allowing enough fabric all the way around to trim. So what I'm going to do now is cut this corner and there from that side around that one corner, and just like this. Now the other thing you want is, do you see that seam is exactly in the center, so that when we sew it, we're going to get a nice straight corner. And now we're going to take this and line it up at 3.5 by 2 inches. Now our 1 3/4 line marks right there at the point. Perfect. We have our 1/4 inch seam, so everything lines up great. And we're just going to trim off this other side like that, and then cut off that little dog ear. And now we have a perfect flying geese, and it measures 2 by 3.5 inches, exactly what we need. Thank you so much for being here. It has been such fun to share this with you. And as always, it is a pleasure to have you here. Have a fantastic holiday and be safe.